Welcome to my Essential Poetry Readings. I'm Andri and I do warmly welcome you all. Today we shall discuss on Palestinian poetry of occupation and exile, more precise, on revolutionary poetry. Today, when we're speaking on contemporary Palestinian poetry, poetry is viewed as an expression and a tool of national solidarity and political consciousness. There are two poles of poets: the nationalist, committed, and politically aware poets, who view poetry primarily as a vehicle and a means of moving the masses. And there is another type of poet, and that is the individualistic one, personal poet who is totally detached from his or her people and setting, having reached a point of abstraction and intellectualization that becomes entirely incomprehensible. In both these groups, the cathartic element is very much visible. In the former, on the collective, patriotic scale, and in the latter, on the personal, psychotherapeutic level. In between are the poets who write committed poetry with a message, but who have somehow westernized themselves and consequently foreignized themselves, their style and allusions, to the point of morbidity and obscurity. The individualistic group is the easiest to deal with in that its impact on the local literary scene is minimal. It includes the shark poets who write to themselves and to each other, looking persistently to the West for inspiration. Foremost among these is Michael Haddad, who has made several attempts at forming Arab literary associations in Israel, supported by Jewish Israeli writers and critics of Arabic literature such as Salim Shashu, Shmuel Morech, and Sassoon Soumeik. Other poets of the group include Jamal Khawar, Fakht Abu Khadra, George Najib Khalil, and Anton Shamas. The poetic progress of these Arab establishment poets in Israel is best expressed in Michael Haddad's poem, The Shadows of the Walk. Quote, "As much as I can, I humor the shadows, but when they narrow, they're no longer mine. And when they widen, they're wrapped in the impossible. Yet, not to get lost, I dip my feet in water, wet the path, and slide." The opposite pole comprises the majority of Palestinian poets, especially those in the West Bank, who followed in the footsteps of their counterparts in Israel, namely Salam Jubran, Tawfik Zayad, Mahmoud Darwish, and to a certain extent Samih al-Qassem. The popularity of these poets of resistance or revolutionary poets and the enthusiasm with which the Palestinian masses and the Arab world embrace their works have established a pattern of imitation and repetition in Palestinian poetry. The current crisis in poetry, with its formulaic nature, exhausted images, and standard devices, can be traced directly to this need to imitate, to have a model and a set standard. The mimetic urge is mostly visible in Al-Qassem, who has established the trend of foreignization, or I may say westernization, in poetry, and who has followed the techniques of the Lebanese poet Adonis, placing them in a Palestinian social and political context indeed. His poetry has progressively displayed a predominance of allusions from Penelope, Bach, Beethoven, Tom Jones, Odysseys, and to now all-pervasive biblical Hebraic events, names, quotations, and personages. Many West Bank poets have slavishly imitated this style by needlessly imposing on their poems obscure allusions and references. Khalil Puma, in Ulysses on his last journey, for example, goes back to the tradition of comparing the plight of Palestinians in exile to the travels of Ulysses on his way back to Ithaca. Samira al-Khatib also uses the parallel of sailors and homeless people, alienated people, sailors for homelessness and alienated people like Ulysses, Penelope, Isis, Osiris. Samih al-Qassem, like them, remains a nationalist poet, and somehow his attempts at giving his poems an international dimension invariably revert to the specifically Palestinian situation. I highlight specifically Palestinian situation. It is this situation that either generated the poem itself or that is reflected in and paralleled by the universal or archetypal conditions of the foreignized and westernized poems. Many of these obscure allusions remain a flexing of intellectual muscles rather than integral and indispensable sources of meaning and activity. Such poems are addressed to and appreciated by the educated elite, who themselves sometimes find this, shall we say, intellectual exercise a bit taxing. The other extreme of Al-Qasim is the one that makes him very much popular, and it includes the more different, somehow direct statements of nationalism and defiance, as well as bitterness and self-pity, which have become the standard form for most Palestinian poetry, especially the contemporary Palestinian poetry. But this is not something that would surprise us. I quote, "O world, my lilies have become, my lilies trumpet sounding about my burning in refuge camps, and I had raised them for centuries and centuries. Upright I walk, head held high, I walk in my palm, an olive twig, and the dove on my shoulders, my coffin." Such is the voice of the poets of resistance, of revolutionary poets, the voice of poet rebel, poet martyr, poet politician. Theirs is the poetry of commitment, and they are the spokesman of a Palestinian nation. Most of their poetry is written in the first person singular, the subjective I, used to include the masses who are suffering but whose pain the poet feels so intensely and conveys to the world. They are the poets who raise generations and signal resistance, for ink has the smell of our blood, in the words of Samih al-Qassem. Mahmoud Darwish, recalling the poems of romance, drink, and fate, now calls for a necessary turn to committed poetry, to Palestinian poetry, addressing the simple people and becoming an effective instrument of Palestinian resistance, analogous to the plow, grenade, and chisel. I quote, "Comrade poets, we are in a new world. What's past is dead. Who writes a poem in the age of wind and the atom creates prophets? Our verses have no color, no taste, no sound, if they do not carry the lantern from house to house, from house to house. And if the simple cannot understand our poems, better for us to shut them and resort to silence. If only these words were a plough in the hands of a peasant, a shirt, a door, a key if only these words were. A poet says, if my poems please my friends and anger my enemies, then I am a poet, and yes, I shall speak.